Okay, so a few members said that they found my last couple of posts informative. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about why I am in this group, why most of us are in this group. Maybe most of us don't realize that's why we're in this group. I worked as a journalist, and about 15 years ago somebody put me onto some bigger background patterns to why we are currently where we are. So I thought we might take a quick look at that. We all know the picture. House prices rising to the stratosphere. Entire generations who are essentially resigned to renting forever. Food prices rising steadily, rising beyond people's means. Every statistical metric shows it, and it's not restricted to here. This is from the UK. These are global issues. Everybody is experiencing stratospheric increases in living costs, in the cost of accommodation and housing, and the cost of food, and the cost of transportation, everyday items. It's becoming more and more of a struggle to put food on the table for your children. So, what's happening? How did we get here? And where are we going next? Why is it so important to find ways to live cheaper? Why is it so important that we have groups like this where people can share ideas on how to reduce living costs, on how to live more simply? Okay, so the first obvious problem is human population growth. I think most of you have probably seen this graph or a version of it at some point. It's one of those things that's so fundamental, so huge, that we tend not to talk about it, tend not to want to think about it, because what can you do? So you can see from the graph over the course of human history, it took us 250 million years to get to 1 billion people. 250 million years to get to 1 billion people globally. And it's taken only 200 years to go from 1 billion to, well, this graph ends at 7 billion, but we are now 8 billion. This is exponential increase. If you fold a piece of paper, if you were to fold a tea towel in half 32 times, it would reach to the moon. That sounds crazy, but go grab a tea towel or a towel and keep trying to fold it in half, and you'll see just how quickly the thickness increases when you have exponential growth. So we live on a highly populated planet. Whether it's overpopulated or not, people will debate. Most experts I've seen say that the Earth cannot possibly sustain more than 1 billion humans living anything like the lifestyles of consumption that we're living. Whether you believe it's overpopulated or not, it is heavily populated. So, how do 8 billion people feed themselves, clothe themselves, transport themselves, keep themselves employed? And the answer, of course, is our old friend oil. Now, most people understand that the world runs on oil, but I don't think most people understand just how fundamentally the world runs on oil. Now, a couple of centuries ago, the oil industry was the whaling industry. That's why we were hunting them to extinction, for their oil-rich livers and their oil-rich blubber. It was an incredibly dangerous industry. Ships represented somebody's entire life savings, and those ships would be gone for a year or two eventually returning hopefully with a full hold, sometimes returning with an empty hold, and quite often not returning at all. They were sailing and navigating into Arctic waters, into the southern oceans. Rendering the oil required building large fires on the decks of wooden ships, the holds of which were filled with highly flammable barrels of oil. You were dealing with massive animals from rowboats. You were dealing with sharks and hurricanes and cyclones. It was a very dangerous business. It was a very risky business, and that made it a very expensive business, which meant that the limited amount of oil we were able to obtain from whales was in turn incredibly expensive. But we did our best to harvest as much of it as we could, because the world's population was growing and the world had an insatiable appetite for whale oil, because we were using it for this. We were using it for heating, and primarily we were using it for lighting. Now, take a look at this oil painting of a high society gathering. Now, all these old homes have huge picture windows, very, very tall windows, and French doors that stretch from floor to ceiling. Look at palaces and how tall their windows are, and that was to let as much light in as possible, because you couldn't just flick a switch and turn on a light bulb. Notice that this painting represents the highest of high society. Everyone in this room is rich, and yet they only have 2 oil lamps burning. The room is actually quite dim, and it's smoky, because these lamps do not burn that efficiently and they produce smoke. So these people are incredibly wealthy, and even at this level of extravagance, they can only afford a dim level of lighting. Most of the world at this time is using candles, and they're going to bed within an hour of sunset. They're getting up at dawn and they're going to bed at sunset, because that's all they can afford in terms of candles. Only the very rich, the very, very rich, can stay up late at night having soirees and dinner guests over while burning whale oil. It's ludicrously expensive because it's in short supply. Then Spindletop happens. Spindletop in southern Texas was the world's first commercial oil well drilled into rock. Now, the people who drilled it were actually originally looking for natural gas. Spindletop had natural gas seeps. A local Sunday school teacher would delight children by lighting the gas on fire where it was seeping out of the ground. So people knew there was natural gas under there, and they suspected that there may be some form of oil. So they drilled and they tapped into the reservoir, and this gusher came out of the ground. Now, that gusher produced 100,000 barrels of oil every day for 9 days before it could be brought under control. That was about 3 times the global whale oil harvest for the last financial year. So this was absolutely revolutionary. This suddenly glutted the market. You no longer had to go out and hunt whales. The whaling industry essentially died overnight, because you could burn this stuff in your lamps. This was an absolutely unbelievable, incredible volume of oil that came out of the ground in 1 week at Spindletop, and the whole world was stunned. Everything changed. Everything changed overnight. And within weeks there were another, I think, 7 commercial enterprises drilling for oil on that same hill. Now, once people realized that oil could be obtained from the ground instead of from whales, a lot of rich people rushed to invest their money in this. But at the same time, this caused an enormous glut on the market. Yes, oil was suddenly very plentiful, and that meant that the price dropped precipitously. If you were in the whaling industry at this time, if your fortune was invested in whaling ships, you were pretty screwed. One man, John D. Rockefeller, already controlled most of the oil industry in the form of whale oil. And he was smart enough to move very, very quickly to take over the rock oil industry as well. And one of the things he introduced was what he called vertical integration, where he would own and control the oil fields, he would own and control the refineries, and eventually he would own and control the gas stations as well. So he would have vertical integration of the business model from source to end customer, and would therefore be able to set and fix his own prices. John D. Rockefeller imagined a United States and a Europe and a world that was entirely dependent on coming to him and him alone for the product they needed. But because there was suddenly such a volume of the product, he had to come up with new ways for people to use it and consume it to keep up the volume of sales. Well, he succeeded. Suddenly, the internal combustion engine was a reality. The internal combustion engine had been invented quite some time back, but it lacked a plentiful fuel source. It lacked a plentiful energy source that was cheap enough to use. And now suddenly, they had it. Rockefeller lined the pockets of politicians. He bullied and threatened. He did everything he could to ensure that the United States developed long lines that would ensure society was lining up to burn enormous quantities of the product he was selling. And he succeeded. And he succeeded. And we now live in a world that is entirely reliant on oil. And it's inevitable that we would have done so because it's just such incredible energy-dense stuff. Now, studies have been done on a concept known as the energy slave, which is when you have an energy source performing work for you, how many slave equivalents is that? So if you had slaves doing a continual steady output task like rowing a Roman galley, for example, if you've got a fit young male slave working steadily at a task, how much energy is that person putting out? So those calculations were done, and then that can be applied to the things that we have around us in the modern world. The energy slaves doing the work for us. So when you see somebody driving down the street in a fairly standard 185, 190 kilowatt Falcon or Commodore, that's the equivalent of 2,500 slaves working continuously. When you pop some bread in the toaster, that's the equivalent of 90 slaves furiously fanning bellows at a flame to generate that much heat that quickly. When you flick on the jug and boil some water for a cup of coffee, that's again about 90 to 120 slaves. If you were an emperor or a king in a previous age and you wanted a hot drink in winter, you would have to dispatch servants to go and do that for you. They would have to gather wood, they would have to split it into kindling, they would have to light the fire, they would have to fan at the fire with bellows, they would have to fetch the water and get the water boiling and make your coffee and bring it to you. So that would be a lengthy process. if a king in any other period in history wanted a hot drink in winter, he'd get it, but he'd get it half an hour later. Now we boil the jug and 60 seconds later we've got our boiling water. So to get things done that quickly would require somewhere between 90 and 120 slaves, all furiously collecting and chopping wood and lighting it and fanning it with bellows. And so each of us is living like kings and queens. We don't realize it, but each of us is living a lifestyle that was enjoyed only by kings and queens and emperors in any other period in history, anywhere on the planet. We can hop in our car. We can hop in our car and transport ourselves, our family, and our luggage 100 kilometers in an hour. We get news from the other side of the planet 20 minutes after it happened. Kings and queens and emperors had to wait literally years to find out whether their army overseas had won a battle and conquered a territory or been defeated. Kings and queens and emperors had to sit in a palanquin or carriage, and it took weeks or months or years to survey and tour their kingdoms. Now we can just hop in our own private passenger car and do things that royalty couldn't do only a couple of centuries ago. So we are living in this fantastically energy dependent civilization, and we just think of it as normal. Nobody gives it a second thought. Oil, however, is used for far more than just transporting us. These are just some of the things that oil is used for in your daily life without you thinking about it. It's not just the petrol in your car. It's the asphalt you're driving on. It's the tar holding the road together. Every time you walk into a business and it's nice and toasty warm, or it's nice and cool in summer, energy is chugging away in the background, allowing that to happen. Every product that you pick up in a shop has been transported to that shop for your convenience using fossil fuels. As I look around me now at the things on my desk, I've got a computer sitting in front of me, big hefty PC tower that required its own weight of fossil fuels to manufacture, just to make the plastics. And it's full of rare minerals and metals that were mined in Africa or Australia using house-sized machinery running on diesel. Then those ores were transported in massive ships to a foundry somewhere, which used massive amounts of energy to turn those mineral ores into refined metals. Even the common ones, the copper and steel and the common alloys, required enormous inputs of fossil fuel to produce those metals. I look around me on my desk, my computer, my monitor, the lights, the GoPro sitting beside me, my DSLR camera. The desk itself, it's not made of wood. It's made of wood which has been purpose grown and then felled and then chipped up into something resembling sawdust and then glued together. So the growing of the forest, the felling of the forest, the dragging of the logs, the chipping up of the logs, all required massive machinery and massive inputs of fossil fuel. Then the solvents which hold the sawdust together into MDF board are also petroleum based. And then it has this surface veneer on it, which is essentially some kind of white plastic, which again comes directly from fossil fuels. The clothes I'm wearing are mostly synthetic, so made directly from oil. The dyes which give these clothes their individual colours came directly from fossil fuels. The can of drink sitting beside me in an aluminium can required massive amounts of fossil fuel input to produce the aluminium can. to produce all the ingredients, to feed them through a factory, which eventually put them into the can, which was then put on a ship and transported to this country, and then put on a truck and transported to the local store that I bought it from. Everything around us. Walk around your home right now and try and find an item that did not require the input of fossil fuels to produce it or distribute it. You are very unlikely to find an item in your home which did not require fossil fuel input. And if you think you found an item that didn't require fossil fuels, you're probably mistaken. You've probably overlooked something in the supply chain. This is our planet at night. We are now consuming 100 million barrels of oil every 24 hours. 100 million barrels of oil to power business as usual. To power our boring, mundane little consumer lives. This is the Iberian Peninsula in southwestern Europe that marks the border region between Portugal and Spain. It's fairly representative of energy consumption patterns in the developed Western world. Asia looks like this. The United States looks like this. Most of Eastern Europe also looks like this. New Zealand certainly looks like this at night. Yes, we have large uninhabited regions, but basically anywhere that's flat enough to grow on, to farm on, to build on, looks like this from space at night. And this is not an artist's representation. This is not a computer-generated image. This is just a cloudless night over the Iberian Peninsula and an astronaut pressing a camera up against a window on the International Space Station. This is not doctored or photoshopped. It is not a composite image. This is literally what our civilization looks like from space at night. Stop and think about that. 100 million barrels of crude oil every 24 hours. Plus the coal, plus the natural gas. Oil, of course, is a scarce and finite, non-renewable resource. Oil only forms under certain circumstances in certain places. Almost all of the oil that we are burning today came from algae, which lived in shallow inland seas. They were shallow, so they were warmed by the sun. Algae growth was prevalent, and as that algae died, it would sink to the bottom of those shallow inland seas, and it would be covered by sediment from river mouths. It then has to be subducted down into the Earth's crust to a particular depth. I forget the exact depth. I think it's something like 10 kilometers to 12 kilometers. It's an area geologists called the kitchen. Any deeper than that, and the organic molecules are burned off and become natural gas and escape through tiny cracks and fissures and pores in the rock. Any shallower than that, and it isn't subjected to enough heat and pressure to turn it into fossil fuels in the first place. So having formed in the kitchen, it then has to be trapped beneath an impermeable cap rock. If there's no cap rock, it will just migrate its way back up to the surface and escape back into the atmosphere or the water as tiny individual droplets of oil and tiny little bubbles of natural gas. So every barrel of crude oil, and every container of natural gas that we are burning today had to be formed under these very, very specific conditions. And it's pretty rare. It's pretty damn rare, and it's pretty scarce, but we are chewing through 100 million barrels of it every 24 hours. And as our population increases, and increases and increases, and as our standard of living increases, as Africa and Asia's poor attempt to emulate the American dream, as people trade up their TVs for bigger ones, our consumption of oil just continues to increase and increase and increase. There's a problem though. The extraction, the consumption of any natural resource, any finite resource, tends to follow a bell curve, what's called a normal distribution curve. So imagine fruit in an orchard. So when you first start harvesting the fruit in the orchard, one, you don't know what you're doing. It's your first day on the job, you're not very good at it. But as you start working at the job, you figure out what to do and what not to do, and you get more efficient at it. You learn to pick faster with less effort. Now naturally, you will go for the low-hanging fruit first. Unless you're instructed to strip an entire tree before moving on to the next one, you will just naturally go for the low-hanging fruit. The big, ripe, juicy apples. The stuff that will sell. And the oil industry did the same thing. Now, the oil industry is a fairly unregulated, for-profit, free market enterprise. So, if you're an oil company like ExxonMobil, and your geologists discover 3 oil fields, 2 of them are small, 1 of them is in a frozen wasteland deep in the Arctic Circle, the other one is deep offshore, and it requires a lot of money and technology to get to it. Or maybe it's in a war-torn country that's undergoing civil war. And one of those fields is a large field and shallow rock. It's not going to be that hard to drill for it. It's in a developed Western nation like the United States, where it's close to the people who will be using it. It's close to refineries. There are already highways and ports and infrastructure. Where do you think you're going to spend your money? Where do you think you're going to invest in the oil derricks? You're going to go for the low-hanging fruit because that's where the profit margin is. The problem is when you do that, once you've picked half the resource, necessarily everything in the second half is not low-hanging fruit. It's the apples that are high up in trees. It's the blemished apples. It's the apples that are deep inside the tree that require you to push past other branches to get to it. It's the small ones. It's the blighted ones. So this is why you have this natural bell curve forms, because when you first start out, you're not very good at it, and the demand for your product isn't there. But as your product starts coming onto the market, more and more people find more and more uses for it. Word spreads, more and more people want it, so demand increases, which brings in money, which allows you to invest in greater and greater discovery and production capacity. You get more efficient at doing it, and you're going for the low-hanging fruit first. So demand continues to increase. Supply continues to increase. But once you hit the midway point, after that, no matter what you do, it is going to get more and more difficult to extract the resource. It is going to require more and more effort to get to the little dregs. It's going to involve going after those pockets that you've previously discovered but you ignored because they were under war-torn countries, or they were deep in the Arctic wastelands, or they were deep offshore. It's going to involve going after those little tiny sips of oil hidden in the rock, where you have to spend the same $300 million building an oil field on top of it, but you're no longer guaranteed billions and billions of dollars of profit over 30 years tapping into a giant field. Now you have to invest $300 million to get to a $500 million deposit of oil. Now you're still making a $200 million profit, but it's not the billion-dollar profits you used to be making, which is why you left it till last. Now, discovery of new oil has to happen before production of oil and bringing it onto the market can occur. Now, this graph, the blue line is production and the red line is the economy. Now, this overlay works equally well for production and economic activity, or discovery followed by production. Either way, you have to bring oil onto the market before that energy can be used to make things, build things, sell things, grow the economy. And your geologists have to discover oil before you can drill for it and extract it. So we expect to see a peak in discovery of a resource, followed by a peak and a subsequent decline in extraction of that resource. And when that resource is energy, which fuels the world's economy, we can also expect to see a peak and a downturn in the world economy. So does this happen in real life? So here's the Wikipedia entry for Spindletop. If you can follow my mouse pointer and look down here, Spindletop produced 17,420,000 barrels of oil in 1902, but only half that much in 1903 as production declined. Only half as much in the second year. So what happened? So what happened is, when Spindletop was first pierced, it was self-pressurized. The oil was under enormous pressure. It wanted to escape from its underground tomb. So they pierced it, like popping a pimple. The oil rushes to the surface under its own impetus, and all you have to do is catch it and feed it into a pipeline. But as the pressure in the well drops, you start having to run pumps to pump it to the surface. And what do your pumps run on? Your pumps run on fossil fuels. So you start having to invest some of the oil you're getting out of the ground into the process of pumping more oil out of the ground. The early Texas oil fields had energy return ratios of about 20-1. Meaning for every 1 barrel of oil they burned up pumping the stuff to the surface against gravity, they got about 20 barrels of oil back. Today, 5-1 is an exceptional figure. The industry average is about 3-1, meaning today most oil operations globally are burning through 1 barrel of oil to get 3 barrels of oil back out of the ground. When you start looking at heavy oil production, shale oil, tar sands and the like, energy returns down to 1.5-1, 1.2-1, which means heavy shale oil production, you can be burning 1 barrel of oil to get 1.2 barrels back out of the ground. Now that's still a 20% profit margin, and most business owners would tell you a 20% profit margin is pretty healthy. But it's not the 20-1 ratios they used to get. Now, that is a significant part of the reason why we have been seeing increased prices at the pump. In order to attain the greatest possible market share, you pass on savings and overhead costs to reduce your retail price to attract more customers. But if your overhead costs go up and start cutting into your profit margin, then you are forced to pass those increases along to the consumer. So this is one of the things that we are already seeing and already experiencing. This graph was not produced by some wild hippie or some doomsday prepper. This graph was produced by the geologists of ExxonMobil for the board of directors. It was never intended to see the light of day. We, the public, were never supposed to see this. This shows regular conventional liquid crude oil discovery and production. The history of it from the 1930s through to the present day, well, at the time, which was 2008, 2010, something like that. Now, you don't have to be a genius to look at this and see the problem. The bars of the bar graph represent discovery of oil, and the black line represents consumption of oil. Global discovery of new oil peaked in 1964 and has been declining steadily ever since. Decade after decade after decade, we have been finding less and less oil. This is despite the industry investing in some incredible new technologies to help them find the stuff. This is not a few years of bad luck in exploration. This is not a case of we've had a bad year, but next year we're just more likely to find a big field. This is a long established trend. We have essentially already found almost all the oil on the planet. The stuff we found first, take Spindletop for example. Remember I said the local Sunday school teacher would light the gas on fire to amuse the young children? Everybody knew it was there. Everybody knew it was there. What we first found were the oil fields that were so big and so obvious that a high school geology student could have spotted them. Once we knew what we were looking for, it was easy to find. It was easy to find the big obvious stuff. And then we hit the halfway mark, about 1964. And ever since then, it has gotten harder and harder and harder to find new oil. Now that big peak you see in the 1970s, that was the discovery of the North Sea fields between the United Kingdom and the Scandinavian countries, or between Scotland and the Scandinavian countries, and the discovery of the Arctic reserves in Alaska. Now, that caused a big spike because those were places that we hadn't had the technology to look before. Nobody had been able to look in the Arctic wastelands because it was just so inhospitable, and nobody had been able to look on the ocean floor because we just didn't have the technology. Now, other than that big spike, it's a pretty clear trend. We've been discovering less and less new oil since 1964. But at the same time, global population has continued to increase. We keep expanding our energy consumption. Our individual footprints keep getting bigger at the same time there are more and more people leaving footprints. So, any housewife who knows how to balance the weekly books can see a big problem starts here. The drop-off in discovery is a huge problem, but an even bigger problem is this: the growing gap between declining discoveries and steadily increasing consumption. We are like kids with a trust fund who are spending the money faster than it earns interest. Fossil fuels are non-renewable. They are a finite, one-time gift from the past. We know they're a finite, non-renewable resource. We always knew from the very first day, we knew eventually they would run out. But we have been increasing our consumption and our reliance on them with every decade, as we've found more and more mundane ways to use the stuff. Plastic bags, shitty toys from China that fill the Walmarts and the warehouses of the world. Plastic packaging in our food. Look around you in your own home and think about all the things that even your parents or grandparents had that would have been handcrafted or made from wood or made from pottery or made from natural fibers like sheep's wool that are now just churned out of factories as synthetic equivalents using fossil fuels. And why do we do that? Because it's a little bit cheaper. It's a little bit cheaper. It's a little bit cheaper to put nylon carpets in your home instead of wool. It's a little bit cheaper to buy a synthetic shirt instead of a cotton one. It's a little bit cheaper to buy a polar fleece jersey rather than a woolen one. And they do essentially the same job, so why wouldn't we take the cheaper option? And of course, population keeps increasing at the same time. So we have a problem. We are spending the trust fund at a faster and faster rate, and that doesn't bode well. This graph represents United States oil production. We can see in November 1970, oil production peaks at 10 million barrels per day. That's the high tide watermark of US oil production, and then, just as predicted, it starts to follow the downward trend. Now suddenly we see this massive uptick. That's fracking and tar sands production and shale oil production. Now fracking is an environmentally catastrophic technology, but it was a technology that allowed US oil producers to inject high volume gas into the rock, pulverize the rock into rubble deep underground, and release the tiny dregs of oil and natural gas trapped in it. That porous rock underneath the capstone layer, the oil is not just sitting in a big swimming pool. It is contained within porous rock. There's no big empty hole in the ground full of oil. It's an area of porous rock like limestone or pumice type stones that have a lot of holes in it that the oil can soak into. It's under enormous pressure though, so it wants to escape to the surface within reason. Once the pressure starts dropping off, the oil lacks the impetus to escape from that porous rock and make its way to the surface, and pumping it out gets harder and harder. Now, one of the ways they traditionally do that is by pumping seawater into the rock. The oil is lighter than the seawater, and the seawater forces it up to the surface, forces it up to the pumps. Unfortunately, of course, it mixes with seawater and gets contaminated, so it then requires extra steps of refining to remove the seawater. Now, this is how the Saudis get their oil out of the ground, by just injecting seawater into the rock to force it to the surface. The problem is, once what is coming out of the wellhead is about 50% injection water, it becomes uneconomic to refine it. You have to use so much energy to heat the sludge, to turn the water into steam, to get it to separate from the oil. You start having to use too much fossil fuels to generate the heat to get more fossil fuels back. So the Saudis have enormous reserves, but the way they inject seawater into it, they will probably only ever be able to recover about half of their known reserves, at which point the half that remains in the ground will just be a seawater soup and completely unusable. Now, this uptick in US domestic oil production comes from the production of shale oil, tar sands, and fracking. Now, these technologies do allow you to get some oil out of the ground. The energy return ratios are garbage, and the product that comes out is garbage, which would require many, many, many steps of refining to get it to a gasoline standard. So you will hear many people saying that the United States is energy independent, that it exports more oil than it imports, or that it exports or it produces an amount of oil equivalent to its own domestic consumption. But that's garbage, because what the United States is now exporting is this heavy, low-grade, low-quality sludge. It's exported because it's only suitable for bunker oil for ships and for refining into plastic feedstocks and refining into low-quality products like asphalt and tar. Meanwhile, gasoline, aviation fuel, high-quality plastic feedstocks, the United States is importing those in ever greater volumes. So while the United States is exporting some garbage, some sludge that is only useful for industrial applications, they are more and more and more reliant on importing all their transportation fuels from other countries. So anybody who tells you the United States is energy independent or that the United States is producing more oil than ever before doesn't know what they're talking about. Yes, it is true that they are producing greater volumes of oil than ever before, but there is a huge, huge difference in the quality and the usefulness of the product they are exporting now compared to what they were exporting in their heyday. Why didn't someone warn us? Well, as I said, we knew from the very first day we started drilling for it that it was a finite, non-renewable resource that would run out one day. But we just got so wrapped up in our convenient consumer lifestyles and the profits that we were making that we just plowed ahead regardless. And now, most of us, I think, are pretty ignorant of these facts. I know growing up as a child, I just thought that plastics and electronics and cars were the most natural thing in the world. I hadn't known anything different, so it was just normal to me. So we've all grown up with this idea of continual growth. We've all grown up with this idea that the future will be better than the past. We've all grown up with the idea of human progress. So it's perfectly natural to assume that your life will be better than your parents' life, and your children's life will be even more magical than yours. Space, 1999, Buck Rogers, Star Trek, the Jetsons. We were all going to be flying cars. We were all going to have flying cars and robot maids. We were all going to be eating food pills that popped out of a synthesizer in our kitchen. Whatever flavour you want, just press a button and out it comes. We were all going to be watching 3D holographic TVs. Progress was inevitable. The problem is, for the last couple of hundred years, progress, the breakneck increase in technology and living standards, has been driven by the massive abundance of cheap oil. Everything in our lives runs on it, depends on it. 2008, George W. Bush gave a press conference and stood on the lawn of the White House and essentially begged the Saudis and OPEC to increase oil production to stave off global economic collapse. A few weeks later, the Saudis reject his plea. The Saudis and OPEC decline to raise oil production. They dismiss Bush's fears of global economic collapse. 3 months later, the 2008 global financial collapse. Now, most people understand the 2008 global financial collapse to be a collapse of the mortgage market because people were being far too reckless with lending and people were packaging up garbage debts as tradable commodities. And yes, that is true. It was all a big, shaky, corrupt house of cards. Yes, that is true. But it was a house of cards built on the principle that if the economy kept growing, everything would be fine. As long as the economy kept growing and more houses were built and more mortgages were issued, everything would be fine. It was a pyramid scheme that rested on the idea of continual growth. And that seemed like a perfectly plausible idea. The problem is, most people don't understand that the economy slowed down because of this. This is what really happened. This is the underlying foundation of the 2008 global economic collapse. George Bush publicly begs the Saudis to increase oil production. The Saudis decline, and collapse happens. But why would the Saudis decline? Now at the time, as you can see in this 2008 reporting, it's all about profit margins. But is it? What's the real reason the Saudis wouldn't raise production? The real reason, of course, is they can't. It used to be that Saudi Arabia had so much oil they could simply walk outside and open the taps a bit wider and glut the global market with some extra oil to dampen prices. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991 and the global market had instant jitters about the availability of oil, the Saudis walked out the back door and opened up the tap wider and flooded the market with oil. And after a brief upswing, the price of oil actually came down in the months following Iraq's invasion of Kuwait. Everybody went back to sleep. It was fine. The Saudis had enough oil to keep everybody supplied. Absolutely no reason to panic. So in 2008, the Saudis are asked to increase production to keep the economy ticking along to prevent global economic collapse. And OPEC declines. And the reason OPEC declined is the Saudis no longer have that excess capacity. The Arabs are pumping balls to the wall just to supply us with what we need today. They don't have extra capacity. And yet, we live within a system that requires continual growth or it collapses. Which brings us to our biggest and most fundamental problem. Agriculture. I chose these two images for a reason, because one is the other and the other is the one. In the 1940s, an average farmer in the US Midwest was using roughly 1 calorie of fossil fuels to produce 1 calorie of food. In the 1940s, an average US farmer was using 1 calorie of fossil fuel to produce 1 calorie of food. We were already breaking even. Today, that same farmer, who of course has been replaced by a giant agricultural corporation, today that same farmer is using 10 calories of fossil fuels to produce 1 calorie of food. By the time it is packaged and refrigerated and transported and arrives at a supermarket where you can drive your petroleum car to go and get it, the ratio has risen to 20 to 1. Packaging, transportation, refrigeration. We've now used 20 calories of fossil fuel to put 1 calorie of fossil. We've used 20 calories of fossil fuels to put 1 calorie of food in your shopping basket. 20 to 1. Fossil fuels have become embedded in our fuel supply. We can only produce enough food for 8 billion people on the scale we do by using massive amounts of machinery, massive amounts of diesel, massive amounts of petroleum-based insecticides and pesticides and herbicides and fungicides. Because when you plant 20 million square hectares of one thing, you invite disease. So you have to pour more and more pesticides and herbicides and fungicides onto those crops to prevent disaster from disease. You have to do things on a larger and larger scale with larger and larger machinery. We are essentially eating oil. The fertilizers that we pour on crops, because we farm so intensively, we strip the nutrients from the soil every season, and then we have to replace it artificially by pouring on fertilizers. The nitrogen component of commercial fertilizers, we used to get that from bat dung. We used to find islands and caves where there were a lot of bats, and we used to pay people to shovel it up into sacks, and that's where the nitrogen and fertilizers used to come from. Do you think there's enough bat shit left in the world to replace this? What we're doing now is we're cracking natural gas to get the nitrogen from it, and that's what's going into our fertilizers. We are essentially pouring oil onto the ground so the seeds we plant can extract the energy from it and convert it into food, so we can then eat it and convert it into energy. And this is why an average farmer is now consuming 10 calories of fossil fuel to produce 1 calorie of food. That's before you even factor in these massive machines. The wheat you see in this image has already consumed 10 calories of fossil fuel energy to produce 1 calorie of food. And then the machinery end of the equation starts. Fossil fuels have become completely embedded in our fuel supply. We are using more fossil fuels than we are discovering. And also we know that the more we burn it, the more we befoul the atmosphere and drive climate change. This is not a pretty picture. Now, a lot of people seem to think that the white knight of technology is going to ride in and save us. That the smart people are just going to invent some amazing new technologies. And there are some renewable energy technologies on the horizon which might help us keep the lights on a little bit longer. But when it comes to the white knight of technology, you need to think of the historic example set by Nazi Germany. Now, at the outbreak of war in 1939, German technology was light years ahead of anything the Allies had. They had the world's first jet fighters. They had the world's first rockets and guided missiles. They had a nuclear program that was well underway. They were working on their own radar. Even at the outbreak of war, the first German fighters had fuel-injected engines where the Allied Spitfires had carburetors. So if they got into a negative G situation, if they went into a steep dive, or if they rolled over onto their back, their carbureted engines would stall and die, whereas the German fuel-injected engines could perform at any Gs, at any angle. The battleship Bismarck and her sister ship Tirpitz technologically were light years ahead of anything the Royal Navy had. Their radar, their fire control systems, everything about them was just Starship Enterprise compared to what we were fielding. German tanks were light years ahead of anything the Allies had. The Sherman and Churchill tanks, we expected to lose something like 20 Sherman tanks for every one German Panzer they managed to kill. But what Germany lacked was this. They didn't have their own oil. They had plenty of coal, but they didn't have oil. Hitler made a desperate grab for this, the oil fields of the Caucasus in southern Russia. Because what Hitler had was a lot of technology, but he didn't have the energy to turn that technology into actual manufactured products. He had scientists who had absolutely incredible ideas on paper, but in order to turn technology, in order to turn science into technology, you need energy. You need energy to mine ores, to put ores into foundries and produce steel, to run assembly lines and bolt things together, and then you need high quality liquid fuels to put in them to run them. Germany had incredible technology that was light years ahead of anything we had. So why did Germany lose the war? Germany lost the war because they didn't seize this. Germany's armies were reduced to marching on foot and riding on horseback and hauling things in carts behind horses. While the United States was the Saudi Arabia of the 1940s. Their oil production wouldn't peak until 1971. They had all the oil, so they were able to churn out aircraft carriers and destroyers and transport ships and cargo ships and aircraft and jeeps and tanks. They were able to produce millions and millions and millions of tons of steel. Their technology was light years behind what the Germans had. Their technology was light years behind what the Japanese had. But through sheer weight of numbers, they were able to simply outproduce their enemies. And that's why Germany had all the Star Trek technology that you see on History Channel. And they still lost the war. Because they had all those ideas, but they didn't have any oil to turn those ideas into reality. And that was with a wartime economy. That was with millions of slave laborers in the concentration camps. It is no coincidence that all the concentration camps were set up very close to factories that were producing things essential to their war effort, because they were using all those Jews and gypsies and gays as slave labor. They were taking their coal and attempting to make synthetic gasoline from it. But even with an army of millions of slaves and a large supply of coal, they were unable to produce enough synthetic oil to keep powering their war machine. And they simply got overrun by weight of numbers. They got outproduced. They didn't get outfought. They got outproduced. They didn't get outthunk. They got outproduced. So anybody who thinks that the white knight of technology is going to ride in and save us needs to understand that high technology, no matter how advanced, without the energy to run it, is useless. What good is your computer or your smartphone in a power cut? You have all the technology in the world sitting on your desk, but there's no energy coming through the wall socket to power it. What good is a Ferrari or a Lamborghini when it runs out of petrol? You've got a very high technology vehicle, but you've got nothing to power it. What good is a Tesla if the coal-fired power station at the other end of the electrical outlet runs out of coal? You've got a very high technology vehicle, but you've got no energy to keep powering it. So that's why the white knight of technology is not running in to save us. What has actually saved us before is the brute strength production capacity of having all the oil. But it's running out. So, what do we do? And why is that relevant to us here in this group? So the first thing to understand is we are already seeing disruptions to food supplies. And this is not going to end. This is not a temporary situation. It's not going to get better next year. Now, things are being masked by the effects of the pandemic and the effects on oil and gas markets of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And these are both serious problems in and of themselves. The pandemic by itself would have severely impacted the global economy. Russia's invasion of Ukraine would itself have severely impacted the world economy. But they are also masking the underlying fundamental issue, which is we are simply running out of fossil fuels. We're not running out of them fast enough to save the climate, unfortunately, but we are running out of them fast enough to have absolutely cataclysmic consequences for the global economy and everything we consider normal. So what can you do about it? What can you do for you and your family? Start thinking about all the ways you use fossil fuels. Start thinking about what you're going to do when the fossil fuels double and quadruple in price. Start thinking about how you are going to transport yourself to your job. Start thinking about whether your job is going to exist. And if maybe there's a different kind of job you can move yourself into. Start thinking about how you transport yourself and your family. Start thinking about how you get your groceries. I went without a car for like 3 years. Sold my car, bought an expensive mountain bike, bought a rucksack. And I'll tell you right now, it's hard. You think, this is sweet, I'm going to save the planet. I mean, it was a really nice mountain bike. Super fun, right? I loved mountain biking. I'm like, I don't need a car. I'll be fine. This is sweet. Problem is, then it's winter and it's raining and you don't feel like biking to the supermarket. You go to the supermarket, there's only so much you can fit in a rucksack. So you end up having to bike to the supermarket 3 times a week instead of doing a once a week shop. You might go to the supermarket and decide to drop by the bottle store on the way home and grab a few beers to watch the game. You go pick up a 24 pack of Spades or a box of Woodstocks and you stick it in a backpack and you tell me how much fun that is to get home. You think to yourself, I'll just pop down to Mitre 10 and grab a such and such, or I'll pop down to the warehouse and grab a such and such. Now our cars have boots and big back seats for a reason. You can just walk into a store and buy a big bulky thing and walk outside and stick it in the back of your car, increasingly your giant SUV crossover vehicle, and just drive it home. Now imagine carrying that item home. Walking home with it clutched in your arms, or trying to strap it onto your back to ride a mountain bike home. And you suddenly start realizing just how difficult transportation is. But more critical than that is food. We're already seeing interruptions in food supply. So, this right here is absolutely the most important thing you can start doing. Food prices are going to start rising astronomically. You want to get your gardens established now. One, you're going to take advantage of the fact that fertilizers and tools from Mitre 10 Mega in the warehouse are currently still fairly cheap. 2, you're going to figure out what works and what doesn't work in your garden. 3, like me, you probably don't know shit about gardening right now, and you know, when you're learning a new thing, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. 4, you are going to very quickly realize how much your family eats compared to what you're actually producing in your garden. So get started now. Housing and accommodation is already stratospheric. Power prices are bad and going to get worse, although it's not too bad in this country because we have a lot of hydroelectric power. Other nations around the world that are more dependent on coal-fired or natural gas-fired power stations are going to start seeing absolutely stratospheric increases in electricity prices. Councils are going to find the cost of treating and pumping water starts increasing dramatically. If you're not currently on a metered user pays water supply right now in your community, you probably will be in a few years. So get your gardens established now and start thinking about how much water you actually need. Get rain gauges and flow meters so you know how much water you're actually getting from rain. You know how much water you're actually putting through your sprinklers. Get the most efficient sprinklers and irrigation systems you can. Start looking at that useless lawn, which is good for nothing but backyard cricket and running around on, and start thinking about how much of that your kids actually need and how much can be turned over to food production. Start looking at every little nook and cranny in your garden and start thinking about window boxes. Start thinking about pots and barrels and planter boxes on the deck. Start thinking about all those sunny spots exposed to rainfall that currently don't have anything growing on them or in them, and start thinking about how you can start turning those into food production. Groups like this are going to become the most important groups anybody belongs to on Facebook. Go join gardening groups, start watching videos, start learning everything you can about what works and what doesn't work. Start gardening now, even if you're not eating the food right at the moment, because I know I'm already producing more vegetables than our family is eating. That's fine. I'm harvesting it and bagging it up, and my 4-year-old is going to be donating it regularly to her preschool. They already do that. They have like a little communal thing where people who overproduce can donate it to the preschool and other families can just take what they want for free. And that's fine because it's all practice. One, it teaches my child to share and care for others and care for the community. And two, it's practice. Because currently we're producing more food than we're producing more food from our garden than we actually use, and a lot of it is going to waste and going to seed. But that's only because 99% of what we end up cooking for dinner came from the supermarket. Start asking yourself about those big gaps on the supermarket shelves that we're already seeing. Start asking yourself about those increases in food prices that we are already seeing. And start asking yourself what you're going to do when those situations double and then quadruple. Every time you do the grocery shopping, start looking at the groceries. And remember, the average item of food on your supermarket shelf travels 5,000 kilometers to get to you. That's a global average for developed nations. It's actually probably a lot worse than that for New Zealand. Most of the food on your supermarket shelf that's been imported from anywhere like Asia or Europe or the United States has traveled anything from 15 to 25,000 kilometers to get to you. Grown with fossil fuels, harvested with fossil fuels, transported with fossil fuels, refrigerated with fossil fuels. Start asking yourself what you're going to do when that system starts failing. Because long before we get to any kind of dystopian Mad Max reality, we are just going to see an inexorable and unstoppable rise in costs and rise in prices. So, the absolute best thing you can do is start thinking about how you can reduce your dependence on fossil fuels And the most critical part of that for everyone is going to be food production. Get busy, people. Best of luck. I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but this is reality. And this is a global situation, which is why you'll see idiots in the comments section blaming Jacinda Ardern for everything wrong with the country at the moment. You'll see idiots in the comments section blaming Jacinda for interest rates, for food prices, for the housing crisis, for the price of gas. But you go look at international news media, you go look at news stories in Australia, Europe, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Asia. Everywhere you will see exactly the same problems unfolding. Supply chain disruptions, inflation through the roof, housing prices through the roof, increases in homelessness, increases in food bank reliance. You're going to see the same stories everywhere around the world, and in each comment section you will see local idiots blaming their local leader for these problems. But these are global, species-wide, civilization-wide issues which are far beyond the control of any individual national level leader of a single country. Nobody is fixing this. Okay? You need to understand nobody is going to fix this. This is not getting better. For 300 or 400 years we've had this incredible bounty of fossil fuel energy available to us, and it's coming to an end. Now, in our lifetimes. Is that significant? It's breathtaking. It's absolutely breathtaking in its implications. And none of us are ready for that. None of us are prepared for that. So start preparing yourself as best you can. And the absolutely number one most critical thing to think about first is food production. So get busy. Good luck. Sorry to be the person that brought you the bad news. But better to know and be prepared than to not know and not be prepared. Good luck, and see you out in the garden.